Greetings and welcome, everyone. Welcome to each and all of you. My name is Wilhelmenia Wilson. I am the executive director at a nonprofit called Healthy Black Families based in Berkeley, California. I'm also an adjunct professor at St. Mary's College of California and a proud and delighted member of the ITLA leadership circles and research circle. We welcome you this morning to our second in a series of webinars that we'll hold on a monthly basis, and are excited to engage in today's conversation. These webinars, as I mentioned, are monthly events that will be offered free for members of the ITLA and at a minimal charge for the larger global transformative learning community. We thank all of you who got up early to join us. We hope you have a nice warm cup of coffee. And we thank those of you in other parts of the world who are spending your evening with us. Hopefully you have a nice savory glass of wine. Okay. Before we hop into our presentation, we like to start with just grounding ourselves. So I invite you all to take a deep breath, and maybe we'll take a deep breath on the count of 5. And then hold it and let it go. As you let the breath go, let go of your day and the things that you've brought here and concerns you've brought with you. Set aside the day that's to come so we can all be very present as we begin this moment of gratitude. On our behalf, I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the countries where we all sit throughout time, our ancestors. We are deeply grateful for their enduring connection to the land and culture, and for their commitment to preserving the knowledge and passing it forward over time, especially through the challenging, devastating, and ongoing eras of colonization. I pay my deepest respects to all the elders past, present, and future for keeping and passing on their worldviews, knowledge, and practices. I express gratitude for the Taiwanese indigenous artist, Itan Pabavolung, who is our first ITLA artist in residence and whose work you see displayed behind me, and whose work is committed to reviving and strengthening indigenous knowledge and practices to restore human living in harmony with nature. We'd also like to acknowledge the stewards and the leadership circle of the International Transformative Learning Association, whose guidance continues to evolve the work of the ITLA and who created this space for us to gather in today. Our mission at the ITLA is to promote critical scholarship, research, teaching, application, and practice of the social, scientific, artistic, and humanistic principles of transformative learning and praxis. As we've created the space, we've identified that we would do this through the areas of education, research, and practice, and our member community. The ITLA Leadership Circle inquired into the ITLA values as we were developing the portal for our public presence or our website. Out of these processes, we identified several core values that were central to our work, and we've decided with each one of our sessions to bring forward one of those values. And the value that we're bringing forward today is synergy. And this value, as it's defined by the tool that we use, is energizing a group group relationships to maximize the creation of new ideas and projects. You'll be able to see more core values as we continue in our webinars. Today, we're excited to present the second of our webinars entitled Crisis as a Transformational Opportunity. Today, we'll have four transformational learning scholar practitioners from 4 different corners of the world who will offer their perspectives in response to this question. Beautiful pictures. First, we have Petra, who's also a member of our ITLA Leadership and Research Circles. She will set the scene by offering her thinking regarding the sources of our existential crisis and the values of Western culture engaging in a paradigm shift towards returning to a more expansive worldview that is metaphysical, including the invisible realm, ecological, feminine, and equalitarian. Then we have Michel Alhadeff-Jones from Switzerland. And Michel will inquire into the assumptions we have about the concept of crisis itself, how they influence the way we conceive transformative processes in adult education. He will discuss the implications inherent in the adoption of event-based versus processual approaches to crisis. Elizabeth Lange is unable to join us today, but Petra will reference her work, which discusses crisis in terms of epochal shift and the cosmo-onto-actual epistemological transformation currently underway. Wow, that was a mouthful. She will describe the role transformative sustainability education can play in rethinking and reclaiming education from within a relationality perspective. And then last, we will have Shirley Walters, who's from South Africa, and she will argue that transformation relating to the climate emergency is unlikely to be led by those who have created the problem. Movements from below are key vehicles to build pressure and create systematic alternatives. Oh my. After each panelist offers their worldview, they will share their perspective on 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll open up to answer your questions that you'd like to pose to them. So please, as we go through, drop your questions, comments, reflections in the chat, and we will engage you in those after the presentations. So I'm happy to turn it over now to Petra to get us started.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wilhelmina, for this very gracious introduction and creating the context for this panel. And hello to everybody. Good morning, good evening, and good day to everybody around the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just before we start, if you would like to see the slides on the left side and the presenters on the right side, what you can do is just go into, or Kirsten, are you doing that automatically? I just see that you're doing that automatically. No, but it worked anyway. Good, okay. Well, let us start. So as I said, or as Wilhelmina said, I'm going to go first. I'm going to go share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes, it looks great, Petra.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So I'm setting kind of the scene for this panel. with inquiring into the sources and antidotes to existential crises. And in doing so, I'm standing on the shoulders of and weaving together the transdisciplinary scholar practitioner contributions from Peter Kingsley, Jay Griffith, and Tyson Younger Porter, who are coming from different regions of the world, from different disciplines, and indeed are transdisciplinary, are indigenous and non-indigenous, and coming from very different backgrounds, yet they are very much overlapping in their perspectives. And what I'm presenting today is weaving that together, and with many, many years of research into disaster risk reduction, preparedness, response, and recovery. So I think we all can agree that we are experiencing globally now a growing existential crisis. We have increasing mental and physical disease to contend with, violence and wars. We just have another war maybe looming in Russia, and maybe even that's going to be bigger. We have climate change and environmental destruction, which is increasingly challenging for us. And we are experiencing extreme natural events, disasters, and now we are all together in a global pandemic. And not only are we experiencing all of those challenging aspects or crises, but we are experiencing them increasingly together, and they are accumulating or compounding. Luckily, Albert Einstein says, in crisis lies great opportunity. So we would like to focus on today crisis as transformative opportunity. However, to inquire into that and having crisis being transformative requires identifying the source. And so I would like to offer some insights into what the sources potentially are. So what are the sources of crises? I would like to suggest that the sources are spiritual, cultural, and ecologically all wrapped together. And that they actually developed gradually, not only over the last couple of years, but actually over millennia or many, many generations. And I invite you to consider that the roots of our Western cultures are ancient, and that they actually precede pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. And not as our modern history wants us to believe, rather than being them primitive, those pre-Socratic Greek philosophers or mystics possessed extensive and deep ancient wisdom. They followed orally transmitted lineages of mystics and healers that actually trace back to the Gnostics and Hermetic traditions. Gnostics come from this beautiful word, and I'm not going to say it because I know we have a lot of people from Greece here, and I don't want to butcher the word, but it means having knowledge or insight. And insight refers to directly seeing inwardly and experiencing our divine nature. Those ancient mystics and healers used ancient transformative techniques of alchemy and magic to carry people over into other states of consciousness that silenced our rational thoughts. And this enabled us accessing and becoming conscious of the sacred, ambiguous, invisible spiritual realms of our ancestors, and bringing from these realms wisdom into our physical world. Those transformative techniques also enabled us to access our true premortal nature and Aboriginal sacred law. And living according to the sacred law and accessing our nature and the spiritual realms enabled us to actually living for others, to transcend our personal concerns, and to have living for others at our focus, and also to live harmoniously with nature and our nature. And all of that created health and well-being for all creatures, not only human beings, but all creatures in our beautiful world. Now then, Plato and Aristotle came along, and they used reason to force our minds to separate from our soul, psyche, and spirit. And in their wake, what emerged was a patriarchal, totalitarian, rational, reductionistic, and objective Western philosophical worldview, which created a culture that gradually domesticated and conditioned us into ways of thinking and living that disconnected us from our ancestors, ancient and universal laws and ways of knowing, our true natural primordial sacred divine nature, and the sacred invisible feminine spiritual realm. And this is basically what we have been living out over since the times of Plato and Aristotle, and which over time was then reinforced by the troika of patriarchy, capitalism, and the Christian Church, which together over millennia have hindered us reconnecting to our sacred nature and the invisible realms and our ancestors by deliberately destroying the conditions that are vital for transformation and maturing of our psyche, spirit, and mind. So basically all the conditions which our ancestors knew contributed to transformation were over the time deliberately destroyed. And I selected here an image of Avatar, and I think Avatar, which was a worldwide and still is a worldwide phenomenon. I think it was the best-selling movie of all times. Just also showing how much we innately know our true nature and harmonious living and living in nature, living in harmony with ourselves and nature, and the devastation which happened when that was destroyed. And I invite you to consider that this actually, the storyline of the movie has been playing out for us as human beings over millennia. So I invite you to consider that living disconnected from our true divine sacred nature and nature created the disharmony, the ill health, and all the destruction and the crises we are experiencing in our world. So what's the antidote? I invite you to consider that the antidote, based on what we have been discovering in our research, there's amounting literature and also those three scholars I referred to before, lies in uncovering and remembering our ancient knowledges. So crises are opportunities for deeply critically reflecting on our source and transforming that source of our crises. And as Mesereau would say, it really presents us with a disorienting dilemma. And interestingly also, now I have problems. Apocalypse, the Greek word for it, the meaning actually means an uncovering of prophetic revelations of ancient or indigenous knowledges. So that's I was very surprised when I discovered that that's a very different interpretation or meaning which it has become to be in our recent times and in our present. So it's actually a huge opportunity crisis for uncovering of prophetic revelations of ancient or indigenous knowledges. And those ancient and indigenous knowledges can enable humanity to engage in the transformative journey required for creating a new culture that restores harmony and balance. That requires then transforming of our fundamental cosmological, ontological, and epistemological beliefs towards a more matriarchal, metaphysical, holistic, spiritual, ecological, equal, and subjective belief system. And as I said, we can restore that by remembering, cultivating, and living according to our true sacred nature, our ancestors, and the ancestral laws. Interestingly here, and we actually had a younger Porter as a panel member, but unfortunately he's a very sought after speaker, so unfortunately we weren't quite able to have him here today, but I thought I'd channel him at least in this way, because he wrote in his amazing book that diverse Indigenous tribes across Australia, and the Australian Indigenous peoples have been around for over 120,000 years, have stories of past Armageddons, warning against the behaviors that make these difficult to survive and offering a blueprint for transitional ways of being so that our custodial species can continue to keep creation in motion. So again, also from today, we know that that Australian Indigenous peoples, and I would infer from that Indigenous peoples worldwide, have really the key for our survival. And so one pathway for utilizing transformative or crisis as transformative opportunity would be to reconnect with those ancient Indigenous knowledges. Which brings me to the end of my contribution to this panel. And if you find that interesting, I invite you to look at the newly published Palgrave Handbook of Learning and Transformation, where my co-author and I are going more into all of those aspects in more detail. So that's finishing my thing. Thank you very much. And I'm handing over now to Michel for offering his presentation. Thank you, Michel.
Thank you, Petra. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really good to be with you today. It's the evening for me. I'm in Switzerland. I'm also would like to thank the organizer of this event. It's a very nice opportunity to share reflection and reconnect with some of you that I already know, and maybe learn to discover new people among you. So I'm very glad to be here today with you. I'm going to share my screen. So, well, I'm also happy to be involved in this process, because I've been actually connected to this community for almost 20 years now. I mean, I remember the first conference I was involved was in 2003 in New York. And so it's also very pleasing for me to see how things have evolved, and how the reflection around this idea of transformation and how we understand it in the field of education has evolved over time. I'm also a member of the Stewards Group and a former co-convener of the Ezra Network on Transformative Processes in Learning and Education. And so I'm always concerned about how we address questions that we share from different perspectives. And for me, my ground in a way is kind of based in two geographic areas: Europe, with the fact that I'm coming from Switzerland, and the US, because I've been working in New York for quite a while, and I'm still associated with Teachers College, where I'm teaching. So it's also with that background that I mean, that's going to inform my presentation today. So throughout the 20th century, actually, the use of the term crisis in scientific discourses and vernacular language has been quite exponential. I mean, we see crisis everywhere: historical crisis, economical crisis, social crisis, and so on. And so in the late 70s, a group of scholars led by a French philosopher called Edgar Morin has tried to reflect on this notion and try to think about the relevance of considering crisis through a specific theory, developing basically a theory of crisis. And I'm going to be inspired by some of this contribution today, as I would like to revisit with you some of the assumptions that we have around crisis and the way they may be related to transformative processes. So the presentation here is also emerging from a reflection that's built up through the last 10 plus years. And I've added here a few references. And actually, if you go in the chat, you'll see at the very beginning of the chat a link to my PowerPoint presentation. So if you want, you can download it. And so you will have access directly to the links, and you can take time to look more in detail about the fine print, the small print. But the idea here in this slide, what I wanted to just stress is the fact that the reflection I'm sharing with you has emerged through a process, and I think it's important also for me to acknowledge that. More specifically, it's built on a paper I've published recently. It's called Learning from the Whirlpools of Existence, Crisis and Transformative Processes as Complex and Rhythmic Phenomena, where I'm trying to connect basically two main influences in my work. On one side, complexity theory. First time I wrote on that was in 2012 in the first handbook on transformative learning, where I was trying to revisit transformative learning theory through the insight of complexity theory. And on the other side, the work I've been doing for the last few years around rhythm theories and the temporalities through which we understand transformational processes. So for me, the reflection that I'm sharing with you today is really an ongoing reflection. It's a work in progress, and that's also why I would really value your insight, input, and feedback to see how we can make it move on. I'd like to start or to continue by reading you a short extract from the article I was mentioning, which basically introduced a metaphor. And I think metaphors are always very powerful to communicate insight. Learning from the whirlpools of existence. And let's take the metaphor of the river. As the river carves its bed, the experience of a crisis leaves deep traces. If retrospectively the erosion caused by the continuous flow of water demonstrates the transforming power of a river, it does not, however, reveal the whirlpools that agitate it. It may be the same with the experience of a crisis. The resulting traces gives an account of the significant changes in which it participates, whereas the everyday learning experiences that contribute to it tend to fade in the memories that we can keep of it. However, the recognition of these whirlpools of experience also carries significant learning opportunities. The swirls refer to our everyday experiences of change. They manifest the intrapsychic, intrapersonal, and social dynamics that form and transform individuals and collectives day after day. More fundamentally, the study of these whirlpools may open up possibilities to interpret the ways in which forms of influence, power, and constraint unfold both in crisis situations and in normal times on a daily basis and over the long term. So to illustrate this point, I could take the example of the COVID pandemics that we are all experiencing. I mean, we've been involved in this crisis for over 2 years now. And so we can relate to what we identify as a crisis based on the everyday experience of having to deal with constraints that are imposed on us, caution that we have to take, conflict, tensions also that built up as we have been facing this situation for quite a long time. Now, if in, let's say, 5 or 10 years from now, we ask people what has been the role played by this experience in their life, reference to the COVID pandemics may appear as an event, among others, in the stream of one's life. In my practice in adult education, I'm working mainly using life history and narratives, life narratives. And so it's interesting to see how retrospectively we tend to identify events that we consider as formative. So an experience like the pandemics may be experienced as a process as we are going through it, but years later may be remembered as a single event. So we see that there is this risk of making it flat in a way and tending to forget all the complexities that went into the negotiation of that crisis. That's what I refer in my work as the rhythmic unconscious, those experiences that repeat themselves day after day, but that we tend to forget after a while because we pass to other experiences. So that leads me to a second point I'd like to make today. The fact that there is basically two perspectives we can adapt to interpret, give meaning to a situation or to an experience of crisis. One point of view is event-based, is to consider crisis as an event. It tends to be, the crisis then tends to be confused with the incident that triggered it, which is considered to be brutal, punctual, surprising, unpredictable, and improbable. Characterized by the rapidity of its development, the compression of the time for decision-making, and the confusion of the circumstances associated with it. An event-based approach to crisis, therefore, tends to favor a study of the facts considered a posteriori, favoring a reactive posture rather than an approach based on anticipation and prevention. Whenever we consider crisis as event, it's usually afterwards that we acknowledge the role and that we are trying to face their consequence and effect, which limits obviously quite significantly how we can process the consequence but also the constituent of crisis. Now, there is another perspective, is just to consider crisis as a process. Then it is envisioned through a progression in its intensity and visibility, allowing for different stages, precursory signs, triggering, amplification, resolution, etc. It should be conceived as the product of cumulative and potentially detectable dysfunctions or tensions, the dynamics of which may suddenly appear out of control. The crisis unfolds within systems whose large number of interacting elements and their interrelationships contribute to making its emergence inevitable, even if it remains unlikely and unpredictable. So a processual approach leads to focus or attention prior to the triggering events on the conditions that favor its emergence, while at the same time questioning the dynamics that allow it to unfold. If I refer here to transformative learning theory, it's interesting because in Medzero's contribution, for instance, disorienting dilemmas that appear as one of the triggering points for transformative process is considered often as an event, where transformative learning is usually considered as a process. And what I would like to suggest here is that whenever we consider crisis as disorienting dilemma, or source of disorienting dilemma, it may be actually quite enriching to consider them themselves as processes and not just events. They are processes that reveal something, and that's what I would like to develop also with you briefly today. So another point that I'd like to make that I think is very important is to point toward the fact that the experience of a crisis can lead to two different kinds of outcomes, and that often actually may appear in parallel with each other. One regressive and the other one progressive. And I'm borrowing here the idea from Edgar Morin. On the one hand, a crisis involves a potential for regression, which is characterized by the laws of complexity and flexibility of the system. The richest qualities and the freedoms acquired disappear, while the most primitive or rigid structures are consolidated. And we see that, for example, when defense mechanisms are becoming very prevalent and people operate cleavage or simplification of the way they give meaning to what's happening, because that's a way for them to protect themselves against the anxiety and the tension raised by the crisis. But that can also feed the crisis itself, because then we observe a polarization of position. And unfortunately, we have been observing that with the pandemic also. On the other hand, a crisis can also lead to progress that manifests itself through the acquisition of new qualities, of properties that contribute to the complexification of the system. From this point of view, the experience of crisis mobilizes processes of reconfiguration that lead to more or less profound disorganization and reorganization that participate in a transformative and even evolutionary process. And so when we connect transformative learning or transformative processes with crisis, that's usually toward that goal that we are going. We're trying to aim at deconstructing assumptions and reconstructing meaning in order to integrate in a more complex way what's going on in the world around us and within ourselves. But what I'd like to point here is the fact that it's never played in advance, and we can never really anticipate. By definition, a crisis is made of unpredictability. And I think it's important to keep that in mind in order to not be naive about the transformative effect associated with the experience of a crisis. So the next point I'd like to make, and I'm going to go very briefly on that slide, that's another point I've been developing in the paper, this idea that there are different levels to interpret in terms of learning what's going on when we experience or when we are facing a crisis. And I take here a distinction that is quite classical now in field of adult education between 3 levels of learning. And depending on the authors we are referencing, whether it's Gregory Bateson, Jack Metziro, or Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen, we'll call them in a different way. But basically the idea is always the same. There's this idea that there is a first level that is a bit more superficial, that's more instrumental, that refer to learning that we have to make in order to cope, usually in everyday life, with situation and adapt to whatever constraint we are facing or problem that we have to solve. Then there is a second level. Metziro will call it communication learning. Bateson will call it second order learning. This idea that at some point we can get to questioning the assumption and the meaning that we are giving to a specific situation. And then eventually there is a third level, much more deeper, but also much more difficult to attain, to get to, which correspond to a form of third order learning or emancipatory learning, where we are really able to challenge the meaning perspective that shape the way we give meaning to the experience we live. And that's where transformation occur. What I would like to say here is that when crises occur, those 3 levels are involved. And with the experience of for example, the pandemics, I mean, from the very beginning, we had to operate at the first level, you know, learning how to use masks, when to use them, how to use them, typical example of instrumental learning. Now, also as the pandemics unfolded, and especially with the different waves of contamination, we may have faced some form of second level, second order learning. With the first wave, from one day to the next, we realized that health systems were overwhelmed by the pandemics, that the capacity were not well built, so that there was a real threat. With successive waves, we may have learned things related to how we organize our lives, how we balance work and family when everybody is confined at home, and so on. So that's obviously a more deeper sense of questioning and learning. And eventually, at some point, we can start questioning whether there is something to change at the systemic level or at the deeper level of our assumptions that may eventually bring transformation. But again, nothing is played here. And in a crisis, there is always this question of whether we are trying to go back to normalcy or whether we are going to be able to really bring new change. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this question, is this crisis going to be able to really bring us to become more aware of what's dysfunctional in our society? It came very early on. Now that we are going back progressively in some areas to some form of normalcy, we can question whether this crisis has been transformational from that perspective. So, and that's really the main point maybe I'd like to make here today, is that the fact there is a form of fluidity in the way we experience crises. I think the crisis reveals the fluidity of formative and transformative processes. The experience of a crisis is characterized by a progression of disorders, instabilities, contingency that increase the uncertainties and makes its effect unpredictable. So we never know exactly what's going to get stabilized and what's going to eventually change and remain different. So crisis highlights the uncertainties, the ambivalences, the ambiguities, but also the tensions and the conflicts, which in a complementary and contradictory way stimulate and hinder the learning processes experienced. So at the same time, we experience tensions that may eventually provoke the desire to change, adapt, and learn and develop ourselves. And at the same time, the tension are also preventing us because we are facing anxiety, fears, uncertainty, and maybe crippled by that. So the experience of a crisis reveals a fluidity that can be found at all levels of learning. Instrumentally, when seeking solution to reestablish a form of normality. I remember during those 2 past years, how much there's been discussion about how we use masks, what's the best way to get protected, and so on. So there was come and go about what to do or what not to do in order to protect ourselves. Now, at another level, when questioning the meanings, the norms, and the values that guide our action, we are also facing some kind of fluidity. Some people, some family exploded because of this crisis. Some people quit their job. So there was decision that may have been taken, but those decisions are never taken from one day to the next. They are fluctuating around tensions and hesitation and ambivalences. And so there is a fluidity there at that level. And so that appears also when we challenge the foundation that guides our own way of living. And so what I'm trying to say here is that transformative processes are made, in my opinion, of this fluidity up to a specific point where things may eventually shift. And some people call that the tipping points. Typically, there is a point of no return, or a kind of irreversibility. So crisis reveals the fluctuation and oscillation that characterize the dynamics of transformation. So my last point here, and I would like to share that here as an opening, is that I think there are benefits from a learning and educational point of view to conceive the fluidity of transformative processes. And I suggest in the article that we may reflect on the experience of a crisis and more broadly on any transformative processes as they unfold by exploring more systematically 3 points, 3 dimensions if you want. The first one is the recurring tensions that shape people, collectives, and organizations' activities, the polarities and the patterns that they manifest, and the preponderance of specific form of antagonism organizing successive periods of the everyday life or of one's own existence. What I'm trying to say here is that when we are facing a crisis, the crisis emerged from antagonism that has always been there. All the tension that we're experiencing today because of the pandemics are not new. They were existing before, but the crisis forces us to confront them and raise the tension, raise the intensity of those antagonisms. So I think it's important to try to read the situation through the antagonisms that are emerging, because that's an opportunity to renegotiate the way we are experiencing them. The second point is the fact that whenever we are facing antagonism, we have to regulate them, regulate the tension. And so it's interesting to see what are the modalities implemented in order to regulate the tension, the antagonism through time. They require resources that go through repetition, cycles, alternance, through which we are able to regulate those tensions. So it's also interesting to see how those tensions unfold through time. And here again, I mean, we can see the pandemic, the different waves, the successive waves of the pandemic as failure of regulating how the virus spread in the population and the social measure implemented. And finally, the last point is that obviously crisis also leads to deep and irreversible changes. So the incremental variations of those weak signals whose effect of saturation may eventually lead to the emergence of thresholds that determine more significant and visible reconfiguration in people, collectives, and organization development. So usually what we remember from a past crisis has to do with those thresholds, with those point of reconfiguration, those saturation that led to change, to deep changes. But again, it's only one component of the experience of a crisis. And as long as we consider those 3 aspects, the tension, antagonism, the way they are regulated, and eventually the saturation that they may lead for, I think that we can nurture a kind of complex understanding of what's going on with the experience of critical events and critical processes. So that's the things I wanted to share with you today. The final thing I would say, if you're interested, is that I have the privilege to present next week a bit longer some of those elements in another webinar. So if you're interested, feel free to join. It's free. And if you're interested to keep in touch, I would also welcome opportunities to discuss those points and welcome feedbacks through the different usual channels of communication that technology provides us with. So I'll be happy to continue the conversation beyond the limited time of this panel. Thank you all for your attention. Let me stop sharing now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michel, for this very fascinating insights into creating crisis as a process and nuances of this process. Wilhelmina, could you please pull up the slides for Elizabeth? So as Wilhelmina shared before, unfortunately, Elizabeth Lange is a panel member, but she experiences her own crisis. Unfortunately, on Monday, her beloved father, who was the rock, the rock in her life, passed away, and so obviously she has to focus on being with this transformative process. However, she sends her deepest regrets that she couldn't be with us here today and share her perspectives. Very fortunately for us, Elizabeth published or just finished a book, Transformative Sustainability Education, which will be published in late 2022 this year. And so if you are interested in this area, you can keep an eye out for this book to be published. And I'm sure we will have at the ITLA a book launch for this book as well. Also, Elizabeth published a chapter in the new Palgrave handbook for learning for transformation, which is the next slide, Wilhelmina. Yep, thank you very much. And she's sharing about living transformation, the alchemy of change and epochal shift, which is absolutely, I read it. It's an absolutely fascinating exploration of living transformation, very much in line with the first panel offering and Michel's panel offering as well. So deeply encourage you to read that. And we now move on to Shirley. And Shirley is a professor emerita of adult education and continuing education at the University of Western Cape in South Africa. She's also the president of PIMA, an international network of adult education and lifelong learning practitioners and scholar activists. And she has been active within social justice-oriented civil society organizations for over 40 years now, both locally and globally, which means coming, from the theoretical, so we started with kind of creating the wider context and the deep time history, going back in history, then Michel creating crisis and transformation as a process and nuance process. Shirley will now take us into the practical side of things and how we can create or use crisis as transformative opportunity for activism. So over to you, Shirley. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and wonderful to be with you all. I know that in my part of the world it's getting quite late, so I'm going to keep it fairly short. For some of you, it's just the start of the day. So thank you so much for this invitation. I'm just going to share my slides. So I'm speaking to you as an activist scholar from South Africa, and I'm raising questions in this short presentation concerning the nature of transformative opportunity. And I ask, to what end and for whom? Southern Africa, where I'm from, which consists of 14 different countries, has been declared a climate change hotspot by international scientists. And this means that we will experience much more severe impacts with more frequent droughts, less regular rainfall, less certain food supplies, more frequent cyclones and flooding. The average annual temperatures across Southern Africa may increase by up to 3 degrees by 2060, by 5 degrees by 2090, temperatures that would render human life nearly impossible. The climate emergency is very much in our hearts, our minds, and our bodies. My views are shaped by this context and by being embedded within 2 real-life crises, multidimensional crises over the last 6 years. The first was a serious drought in Cape Town, where I'm from, which was in 2017-18. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic from the early 2020s. What is clear is that the deep social, economic, and political problems of our times are certainly not signs of a passing moment or a single issue. They rather signal multifaceted crises whose components all strengthen and reinforce one another. As COVID took hold around the world, almost everybody seemed to reappreciate the values of solidarity, mutual aid, and cooperation. When COVID-19 laid bare the limitations and shortcomings of the institutions of power, social communities or local communities rose to the occasion. The media headlines often focused on selfishness and individualism, with images of hoarding and empty supermarket shelves. Meanwhile, community-driven networks showcased the power of self-organization to move beyond both the market and the capitalist state. As an example, in Cape Town, we established within days of the pandemic a network across the city called Cape Town Together, where 160 community action networks organized in solidarity across class and racial divides. Here in this slide are some of the volunteers who are gathering fine-grained data on citizens' well-being and informing the Department of Health and one another about what needed to be done. Globally, there was hope that governments would work collaboratively to overcome the pandemic, and there may be transformative opportunities to favor transnational cooperation rather than competition. But soon the raw competitive economic and political interests of nations gained ascendancy. The politics of vaccinations has exemplified the narrow, nationalistic, self-serving approaches taken, so that in some countries, 70 or more % of the citizens are vaccinated, while across Africa, it's an average of 4%. This is at a time when good sense is that none of us is safe unless we're all safe. Even the usually measured Southern African epidemiologists became enraged in November last year, when the United Kingdom, North America, Europe, and other countries, including Australia, overnight closed our borders without consultation. They put Southern African countries on red alert and banned all travel to and from the countries in a failed attempt to keep Omicron virus out. This was at a time when Southern Africa was reeling from the socioeconomic meltdown, and scientists knew that the virus knows no borders. This is another example of the increasingly polarized realities in the political North and South. Of course, comedians were quick to amplify the absurdity and the political interests at play. When the pandemic struck, many countries had not recovered from the previous decade's global financial, economic, and social crises of 2007 and 8. In this context, the convergence of the climate emergency and the pandemic has resulted in a sharp increase in the prices of staple foods on which the majority of poor people in the South depend. In October 2021, the World Bank published a report that showed how in the years before the pandemic, chronic and acute hunger was already worsening due to wars, climate change, amongst other factors. And increasing number of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America face growing levels of food insecurity. But as we all know, not everybody suffered during the pandemic. Global inequality significantly increased in the past 2 years. There was a billionaire boom with the super rich soaking up the COVID cash. The pandemic reinforced a trend that has begun in previous decades. Central banks injected $9 trillion into national economies worldwide in response to the health emergency. But a considerable portion of this stimulus went into the financial markets. As a result, the total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by $5 trillion to $13 trillion between April 2020 and April 2021. Not a bad profit. The most dramatic surge ever recorded on the annual billionaire list compiled by Forbes magazine. So when we address our topic, crisis as transformative opportunity, what do we mean? What is the nature of the crisis, and for whom are the transformative opportunities? In the weeks leading to the recent climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, referred to the current situation as code red for humanity. Eminent scientists had presented very grim predictions of the current and future projections of the state of the planet. As Daniel Chavez states, like in all the previous 25 COPs, Glasgow ended with a new round of empty promises. The Transnational Institute states in a recent report that the world's biggest emitters of greenhouse gases are spending on average 2.3 times as much on arming their borders as they are on climate finance. It's clear to those who are concerned with climate justice that those who have created the climate emergency are not going to lead the urgent push for systemic changes that are so desperately required. Climate justice is attained by foregrounding the needs and interests of the people who have contributed least to the climate catastrophes and are most affected by them. The climate and ecological crises have particular impacts on the majority of women. Majority of women, as we know, carry primary responsibility due to unequal patriarchal divisions of labor for putting food on the table, taking care of ecosystems, families, and communities. Applying an ecofeminist analysis, entanglements of ecological breakdown, capitalism, racism, and patriarchy all need to be tackled to avert the environmental catastrophes. This will not be led by those most invested in maintaining the status quo. To create a transformative opportunity, which is just for the majority of people, movements from below are key vehicles to build pressure and create systemic alternatives for those most impacted by the multiple crises. But having said this, we need a sober analysis of what the limits of social movements are for systemic change. For example, immediately after the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, there was a global wave of discontent and uprisings that spread across the world. It was the time, you may remember, of Occupy Wall Street, the Spanish Indignados, the massive youth riots in Brazil and Turkey, amongst others. We need a serious discussion on how and why those popular struggles did not achieve their objectives. In the same way, we need a sober analysis of both the potentialities and the limits of the type of prefigurative experiences of community mobilizing we have witnessed during the pandemic and other crises. What roles do and can they play towards just transitions and just recovery? Does the nature of the crisis shape what transformative opportunities are possible? We also need to recognize that these are, as we've heard from Petra particularly earlier, these are harsh times for transformative or emancipatory action, given the political crises visible in erosion of basic institutions of liberal democracy, the rise of the far right, racism, xenophobia, and misogyny on the rise. At the same time, we see a lot of new deliberations, for example, on the nature of the state and the role of the public sector. For instance, the pandemic reaffirmed the importance of an effective public health system. The economic devastation caused by the pandemic had turned decades worth of economic orthodoxies on their head. So ideas of the basic income grant have come back onto the table in various countries. Public officials, trade unions, and social movements are reclaiming public services to address people's basic needs and respond to environmental challenges. As a colleague, Vishwa Satka, who's a South African scholar activist, urges, to bring about deep transformation, we need to work in, against, and beyond the state, with social movements as an essential part of these processes, to bring pressure to bear, hold leaders to account, and create alternative visions. The prevailing mood may still be confusion and despair, but there is some room for hope, as long as we remember we are all in this together, and that pedagogy, politics, including organizing, are absolutely integral to crises potentially becoming transformative opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. That was fascinating. And I think broadened out also our conversation with the panel from individual to the collectivistic, and that we indeed are all in that together, and to transform and use this crisis as transformative opportunity. We all need to be in it together and transform together. So thank you so much. Well, that brings us to the end of the offerings of the panelists from the different perspectives, from the different countries. We hope you enjoyed those ones. And we thought that before we open it up to comments and questions from you as the audience, that it might be useful for us to ask a couple of questions of ourselves. So we came up in the lead up to this panel to with 3 questions. And so I would like to start now with asking Shirley and Michel the first question. So the same phenomenon may be interpreted as a crisis by someone, but not by someone else. Can people interpret crises differently with different outcomes? Michel, would you like to start?
Yes, and I will be a bit brief because I realized that I was clearly totally in the flow and went much too far in time. I apologize for that.
Good.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's obvious to me that the experience of crisis is a highly subjective experience because it depends the way we relate to the phenomenon itself. I mean, and the intervention from Shirley earlier really stressed that very well. I mean, the reality of the pandemic is so different depending on where we are living in the world, and even in the same country. I mean, whether you're working in the emergency room as a nurse or as a doctor, or you lost your job and you are unemployed at home, you experience the crisis in a very different way. And I think that's the level of urgency of the crisis itself is very different. And to connect also with the environmental crisis, I mean, it's obvious that the population that are the most concerned by it will experience that sense of urgency in a much higher intensity that people who are feeling like far away. And that's, I think, one of the big difficulty from a learning or educational perspective is that we are not experiencing the same thing. So for me, that's the question, is how can we bring people who have so different experiences for very legitimate reason, actually, because they're not living in the same area, because they're not doing the same activity and so on. How can we bring people to understand the perspective of others who experience what is critical in a very different way? I think for me, that's one of the challenges, is how we bring people to share a similar perspective, although they don't share the same experience itself, in order to be able to dialogue around the tensions that are raised.
Yeah, very, very important question. Thank you, Michel. Shirley.
I think drawing on experience from our the water crisis or the drought in 2017-18, what was very clear is that the experiences of the lack of water were very different across classes. And of course, that linked to across racial classifications as well. So it was an extremely different experience. So while the middle classes were hearing about the devastation of having potentially not having water coming out of the tap, for working class and poor people, they were used to not having water coming out of the tap, and they were used to having to walk sometimes kilometers to get to a tap. And to actually, so when on, sort of through the public media, like the radio and so on, where there was so much hype around the drought, for the majority of people in the country, this was actually normal. And in some countries in Southern Africa, because we're about the 30th driest place in the world, for I think in Botswana, in Setswana, there isn't a word for drought. There's a more nuanced understanding of what drought means, and because it might be the year that we haven't had rain in February or something like that, rather than having some common understanding of drought. So I think that certainly social class is absolutely critical, and usually that intersects with issues of race, of gender, and so on. So nobody will experience the crisis the same. But I think if you're trying to respond to a crisis, you have to look at it from certainly from a social class perspective, which then, of course, intersectionally cuts across. So, one of the community workers I was talking to, she said, look, we are in the same storm, but we aren't in the same boat. So yes, we're all, we're under this big umbrella, but don't assume that my experience is your experience. So I think if you're trying to work with that crisis as the government or as civil society or whatever, you have to be understanding those differences from the outset. Otherwise, you're solving the problem for an elite few.
Very important point. Yeah, so very diverse interpretations, and those interpretations are depending on our personal characteristics, but also on the conditions we are living in, and those conditions are very diverse in itself. So very, very complex, right? Now, I like to add to that mix from the perspective, if you're going back in deep time, that because of the conditioning we all have been subjected to over millennia, we have been really so suppressed in trusting our own intuition of recognizing even crises. So for some people, there might be even no recognizing of the crisis in the first place. So there might be, like to stay with your analogy, Shirley, they might be kind of clinging on to the boat, but actually not being part of the boat, or they might be, you know, sailing like nothing is happening in the world because of the conditioning. They're not able to recognize even how deep we are in crisis, right? So it's breaking through those conditionings as well, which is required. And maybe, you know, we need such a huge crisis. The crisis needs to be matching kind of our deep inertia we are experiencing as humanity as such, to break through that. And that's the challenging, big challenge from my perspective in our times. Good. So that brings us to the next question. So because the experience of a crisis by definition threatens the integrity of a system, of us, you know, personally, but also of us collectivistically, it generally triggers typically unconscious defense mechanism. And so then the question is, and those defense mechanisms could prevent transformation. So how could we facilitate people and societies being able to utilize crisis as transformative opportunities? Over to you, Michel, again.
Well, my intuitive response is that I'm not sure we can utilize crisis, because I think when we get to the crisis, to some extent, it's already too late for some change to occur, because some things are already in the process. As I mentioned, it is kind of unpredictable. Now, I think, and again, that appeared very clearly in Shirley's presentation, the number of antagonism, including political, economical, gender-based, racial-based, are revealed by the crisis. And so that's why I think there is an opportunity in the crisis, not so much about what's going to emerge from it, because in a way we don't have control on that fully, but I think there is an opportunity in working on what the crisis reveals. And so from that perspective, I think what's important in the experience of crisis is what can we learn from it about the way we regulate the tensions that are shaping societies. Again, the crisis reveals tensions that were there before. All for example, again, to go back to Shirley's presentation, all the inequalities that she was referring to were existing before COVID emerged, or before the environmental crisis became more prevalent. So the question is, how can we take advantage of the revelation, in a way, of those tensions that many people may be in denial of or may not want to address, to question the way we regulate them? And that's really where I think there is something to think about transformative learning and transformative opportunities, to see them not as a reaction to an event, but as something that is built through anticipation or regulation. And that's where the political is crucial, because politics is all about regulating tensions. And so maybe those crises will reveal people's capacity to embrace the political dimension of a reality that they may have seen as apolitical until then. I don't know. That's maybe I'm too optimistic, but I really think it's about how can we develop the capacity, the intelligence, in a way, to see in the everyday life the sources of crises that seems big and that are big. And that's for me, it's how we connect those tensions at the everyday level with the large scope that they may carry at the humanities level. That's a challenge for educators.
Right. Thank you. Very insightful. I have to take care of a little bit of a personal crisis here, because my power is about to finish. So I'm just getting my power lead before Vice Shirley is answering this question. So over to you, Shirley, and I will be back in a second.
Sure, thank you. I'm going to give a practical kind of example again. I hope it's helpful, but going back to the water crisis that we experience and continue to experience. I think water is fundamental to life, as we know. So there are several people in our city who have said we need to learn from the drought and the extreme drought that we've had. So there have been a number of different people taking initiatives. So the first, one of the initiatives was from the University of Cape Town, a climate change institute, and they set out doing detailed interviews with people across class, across race, across urban, rural divides, in order to understand what their experience of this crisis was. And that's actually now become a resource for anybody. It's freely available. You can go onto the website and you can listen to all these interviews of people's experience. So that was kind of a first step to try and harvest what, in fact, people's experience was. And then the center at the university also then set up a participatory research process whereby they enrolled community-based researchers and they trained them to interview, and they firstly collectively decided on the questions they were going to ask. And then people went out into communities and they've interviewed people and so on. Now that they then analyzed the data together, the community-based people, the university people, and they've now presented that to the city to talk about what some of the solutions could in fact be. And so what they've done is they've used people's stories as a basis for trying to develop new policy in the city. So I think that's a kind of a practical example of saying, how do we maximize this situation, which is full of diversity, full of difference, but in fact harvesting the stories, which then it's created a dialogue between the city and the university and community members. And there's something called a water caucus, which is a civil society organization. And they've all come together to try and make sense of this and to see how to go forward. Just an example of sense making.
Thank you so much for this very practical example of how we could use that crisis as transformative opportunities. And I resolved my personal crisis. And I guess this is also, an example of, I could have been ashamed, right? And I could have tried to cover it up. But one of the things is actually to respond to crisis and actually acknowledging, first of all, there is a crisis and to be authentic about it. And to use humor to respond to a crisis as well. And then to learn from it and to resolve it. Now here at our university, in terms of crisis, we are utilizing crisis as transformative opportunity by indigenizing our curriculum. And how we are doing is actually using the crisis of as a kind of a motivator for people to not in a way of being confronting, but of saying, this is the reality. We can put our heads into the sand, or we can actually recognize there is and acknowledge that there is a crisis, and then to come together to work out together as a team how to respond to this crisis. And so we have been, as a team within my department, the psychology department, but also the larger university and the larger nation, indeed, of going on to, and we are very clear, Michel, that this is a journey, and that is a long-term journey, where we are really embarking at inquiring into the history of how did we get here, and how can the indigenous knowledges of our First Nations people, how can we learn more about that? Obviously, indigenous peoples having survived a lot of changes and crises over 120,000 years, and not only still being here, but still being here in response to all of this environmental crisis, but also the crisis of colonialization over the last 200 years, that they're still here means their knowledges, their worldviews, their practices are holding a lot of value. So how can we learn, and how can we learn together with Indigenous peoples and come up with solutions on new pathways forwards, which brings us out of the crisis? So it's very much recognizing, Shirley, that we are in the same boat, and to use what we have in the boat and within ourselves of making the boat into a beautiful sailing boat where we can all thrive and where we can all develop our capacities to go down the river, Michel, and use the journey to develop our capacities further and enjoy the ride. So I think that brings us to, unfortunately, we had a really good third question, but I think we are running out of time with the, unfortunately, and it was actually of a deeper and extensive and continuous conversation, which we would like to continue with you inside of the Transformative Learning Association. And on that point, thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm handing back, and thank you so much for our panelists, to Michel, to Shirley, and to Elizabeth as well. And I'm very, very deeply grateful for you joining us and engaging us in this conversation.
Yes, thank you for a thoroughly thought-provoking conversation. I sit in appreciation for the strong theoretical basis that were presented, but also for many of the very tangible examples about how these might be translated into transformative action in the grassroots spaces of our society. Our next ITLA events, we have an event coming up on March 11th, and then we'll move to our virtual International Transformative Learning Conference, April 6th through 9th. And then following that, we'll have a webinar that will surface highlights of the International Transformative Learning Conference. As always, we hope you all will join us as members of the International Transformative Learning Association. You can do that via our website at various levels that you see displayed here. That will allow you unlimited access to the content we're generating through these webinar series and other content. And as Petra said, thank you to all of our presenters, to all of those who joined us here today, and we hope to see you again very soon. Please go back to the website and, as Petra said, continue to engage in this stimulating conversation. All right, be well, have a great week. Thank you, Michel. Thank you, Shirley. Thank you, Petra. And thank you, everyone who has been with us here for this last hour and a half.